The restaurant was bustling that afternoon. Plates clinked, laughter filled the air, and waiters hurried between tables carrying steaming dishes. But in a quiet corner near the window sat an elderly woman, her hands trembling slightly, her eyes weary. She held a small container of homemade food and looked around nervously before slowly opening it. Across the room, a young manager noticed her. Without hesitation, he strode over, grabbed the container from her hands, and tossed it straight into the trash. The entire restaurant went silent. The woman didn't scream or protest. She simply lowered her head and whispered something no one could understand. Then, 10 minutes later, black SUVs rolled up outside the restaurant. A convoy. Uniformed men stepped out. And suddenly, the same manager who had laughed at the elderly woman realized he had humiliated someone he should never have crossed. It was a warm afternoon in a small town. The restaurant, Golden Fork, was known for its stylish ambience and high-end menu. People came there to celebrate birthdays, close business deals, or mark special occasions. At exactly 1:15 p.m., the glass door opened slowly. An elderly woman entered. Her clothes were simple but clean, and her gray hair was neatly tied into a small bun. In her hands she carried a worn cloth bag. For a brief moment, the room quieted as curious customers glanced at her, wondering if she was lost. Her name was Margaret Collins. Margaret scanned the room nervously before settling at a small table by the window. She sat down carefully and placed her bag on the chair beside her. A young waitress named Lily approached politely. "Good afternoon, ma'am. Would you like to see the menu?" Margaret smiled gently. "Oh no, dear," she said softly. "I brought my own lunch. I just wanted to sit somewhere warm for a little while." Lily hesitated. The restaurant typically didn't allow outside food, but something about Margaret felt harmless and kind. Before Lily could respond, a sharp voice cut through. "Is there a problem here?" It was Eric Dalton, the restaurant manager. Eric was known for being strict. He cared deeply about the restaurant's image and hated anything that seemed out of place. His eyes immediately locked on Margaret's container. "What's that?" he demanded. Margaret looked up, nervous. "Just some soup," she replied. "Homemade. I didn't want to bother anyone." Eric's expression hardened. "You can't eat outside food here." Margaret nodded slowly. "I understand. I can leave if it's a problem." But she had already opened the container slightly, and the comforting aroma of warm vegetable soup filled the air. For some reason, this only irritated Eric further. Before anyone could react, he snatched the container from her hands and threw it into the trash. Gasps echoed throughout the restaurant. Margaret stared at the bin silently. Her lunch, gone. Instead of arguing, she folded her hands in her lap. "All right," she whispered. Then she said something unusual. "My grandson won't like hearing about this." Eric scoffed. "Oh, really?" he said sarcastically. "And who exactly is your grandson?" Margaret didn't answer. She simply gazed out the window. And waited. The restaurant gradually returned to its usual noise, but many customers felt uneasy. Lily stood frozen nearby. "Ma'am, I'm so sorry," she murmured. Margaret smiled kindly. "It's all right, dear. Sometimes people forget kindness when they're busy." Eric rolled his eyes and walked away, muttering about rules and standards. Margaret remained seated, quietly watching the street outside. 5 minutes passed. Then 7. Then 10. Suddenly, someone at a nearby table spoke. Are those military vehicles?" Several heads turned. Outside, 3 black SUVs slowly rolled up in front of the restaurant. Then a 4th. The doors opened. Uniformed men stepped out. Whispers rippled through the room. Eric walked toward the window, confused. "Who called in a security convoy?" he joked. But the men were not joking. They walked straight to the restaurant entrance. The door opened, and the room fell completely silent. At the front was a tall officer with a calm yet commanding presence. His gaze scanned the room until it settled on Margaret. Immediately, his expression softened. "Grandmother," he said gently. Margaret looked up and smiled. Standing before her was Colonel David Collins, her grandson, and one of the most respected officers in the region. Eric's smug smile vanished instantly. Colonel Collins approached Margaret's table. Every customer watched in stunned silence. "Grandmother," he said softly, kneeling beside her chair. "Are you all right?" Margaret touched his cheek affectionately. "I'm fine, David. I was just having lunch." David noticed the empty container. "No food?" Lily hesitated. "Sir, the manager threw it away," she whispered. All eyes turned to Eric. Colonel Collins remained calm, but the atmosphere in the room had shifted. He approached Eric. "You threw away her food?" he asked quietly. Eric stammered. "Well, sir, we have rules. No outside food allowed." David nodded slowly. "I understand rules," he said firmly. Then David said something that made everyone in the restaurant hold their breath. "But my grandmother cooked that soup this morning, for her hospital visit later." Eric blinked, stunned. "Hospital visit?" Margaret spoke gently from her table. "The children's ward," she explained. "I bring soup every week for the nurses and patients." The room fell silent once again. David continued, his voice steady but full of emotion. "My grandmother spent 30 years volunteering in hospitals. She raised me when my parents passed away. Today, she just wanted a quiet place to rest for a moment." Eric's face went pale. I didn't know," he whispered. David scanned the restaurant, his gaze calm but firm. "But now you do." What happened next surprised everyone. Colonel Collins did not raise his voice. He didn't issue threats or demand apologies. Instead, he returned to Margaret's table, pulled out a chair, and sat beside her. Then he turned to Lily. "Could we order the same soup my grandmother brought?" he asked kindly. Lily nodded quickly, her eyes wide. "Yes, sir." Within minutes, the kitchen rushed to prepare their finest soup. When it arrived, David placed the bowl gently in front of Margaret. "Lunch is served, Grandma," he said with a warm smile. She smiled back and took her first spoonful. The simple act seemed to fill the room with quiet warmth. Then something unexpected happened. One by one, the customers began to stand. They approached Margaret's table, some thanking her for helping children, others quietly apologizing for their earlier silence. Even Eric stepped forward, hesitantly. His voice trembled. I'm very sorry, ma'am," he said. Margaret looked at him with kindness. "Kindness is more important than rules," she said softly. "But it's never too late to remember." Eric nodded, ashamed. That day, the restaurant changed its policy. No one would ever again be turned away simply for needing a place to sit and eat. Margaret's soup became a weekly tradition. Every Friday, she would bring it to the restaurant, not just for herself, but for anyone who needed it. The story of what had happened spread quickly through the town. At first, it was whispered among customers. Then someone posted about it online. By evening, hundreds of people were talking about the kind old woman and her soup. Yet Margaret herself had no idea. The next Friday morning, she woke before sunrise, as she always did. Her small home smelled of fresh vegetables, herbs, and warm bread. Carefully, she stirred a large pot of soup. Cooking had always been her way of caring for others. 30 years earlier, when her husband passed away, Margaret had found comfort in helping people. Every week she visited the children's hospital, bringing homemade soup to nurses, parents, and sometimes even the patients who could enjoy soft meals. She never sought attention or recognition. To her, kindness was something quiet, something personal. As she packed the containers into her cloth bag, her gaze fell on a framed photograph. It showed a young boy in a school uniform, her grandson David. She smiled softly. "Look at you now," she whispered. "A colonel." A car horn sounded outside. David had arrived to pick her up. When they reached the restaurant that afternoon, both of them froze. A line of people stretched all the way outside the door. Margaret looked around, confused. "David, Why are there so many people here? David frowned slightly. I'm not sure, he admitted. As they approached, whispers spread through the crowd. That's her. The soup lady. The grandmother. Suddenly, Lily ran outside, her face lighting up when she saw Margaret. You came! She exclaimed. Margaret blinked. Well, I usually come on Fridays, she said softly. Lily smiled nervously. You might want to see this. She opened the restaurant door. Margaret stepped inside, and froze. A long table had been set up in the center of the room. Dozens of empty bowls were arranged neatly, and above them hung a large sign. Margaret's Friday Soup, free for anyone who needs it. Margaret covered her mouth, overwhelmed. Who did this? She whispered. Lily pointed toward the kitchen. Eric stepped out slowly. But he looked different this time. No arrogance, no sharp tone. Just humility. I did, he said quietly. Margaret stared at him, her eyes wide. Eric continued, softly but sincerely, explaining that he had finally understood the true meaning of her kindness, and that he wanted to help honor it. I went home that night and couldn't sleep, Eric admitted, his voice quiet. I kept thinking about what you said, about kindness being more important than rules. He took a deep breath. So I thought maybe the restaurant could help. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. That afternoon turned into something no one could have expected. Margaret stood behind the long table, her soup pot steaming gently. David stayed nearby, watching proudly. One by one, people came forward. A construction worker who had skipped lunch. A tired nurse finishing a double shift. A mother with 2 small children. Even a homeless man who usually sat across the street. Margaret served each bowl personally. She smiled at everyone, asked their names, and listened to their stories. Within an hour, the restaurant that had once thrown away her food had become a place of warmth and compassion. Customers who came for expensive meals began buying extra bowls, not for themselves, but for strangers. The atmosphere had completely transformed. At one point, David leaned toward Eric. You know, he said quietly, you turned a mistake into something meaningful. Eric shook his head. No, he replied. Your grandmother did. Across the room, Margaret laughed with a group of children. Her small soup pot was almost empty, but the room was full of something far more valuable than food, respect. Months passed, and Margaret's Friday soup became a beloved tradition in the town. Every week, more people came, some for a meal, others to help. Local farmers donated vegetables, the restaurant provided the kitchen, and volunteers came to chop, stir, and clean. What had begun as a humiliating moment had grown into a community movement. One afternoon, a young boy approached Margaret shyly. Ma'am, he said, my mom is in the hospital, and she says your soup makes people feel better. Margaret smiled warmly. Well then, she said, handing him a container. Take 2. David watched from the corner. His grandmother looked small behind the big soup table, but to him, she was stronger than any soldier he had ever commanded. He realized that day that true strength isn't always loud. Sometimes, it looks like an old woman quietly feeding strangers. By the beginning of winter, Margaret's Friday soup had become bigger than anyone imagined. People from other towns came, some to taste the soup, others to witness the story of the old woman whose food had once been thrown away. Margaret never mentioned that part herself. When asked, she simply smiled and said, Sometimes mistakes help people remember how to be kind. The restaurant looked different every Friday afternoon. A corner of the dining hall became a small serving area. Large pots simmered slowly, filling the air with the aroma of vegetables, herbs, and fresh bread. But Margaret still insisted on cooking most of the soup herself. David often worried. Grandma, he said one evening while helping her carry vegetables into the kitchen. You don't have to do all this alone. Margaret chuckled softly. I'm not alone anymore, she replied. And she was right. Volunteers were already at work, Lily chopping carrots, Eric washing large pots, teenagers slicing bread. The place that once cared only about expensive meals now felt like a home. But one winter Friday, something unexpected happened. Margaret didn't arrive. At first, no one noticed. People assumed she was running late. Lily checked the door repeatedly. Eric kept glancing at his watch. Even the regular visitors whispered, "Where's Margaret?" David arrived alone. The room grew quiet. "Colonel, is Margaret okay?" Lily asked nervously. David forced a small smile. "She's resting today." The truth was more serious. Margaret had been feeling weak for days, and the doctor had insisted she stay in bed. For the first time in months, the soup table stood empty. Some people looked disappointed. Others considered leaving. David stood near the table, unsure what to do. Then Eric stepped forward, picking up the large soup ladle. "Well," he said quietly, "Margaret started something here." He turned toward the kitchen. "So we shouldn't stop just because she's resting." Lily smiled. "I already made the soup," she said. Volunteers jumped into action. Within minutes, bowls were being served again. But something felt different. Everyone realized something important that day. Margaret hadn't just been serving soup, she had been serving hope. Later that evening, David returned home with a small container. Margaret sat near the window, wrapped in a warm blanket. The smell of soup filled the room. She smiled when she saw the container. "Did the restaurant close today?" she asked gently. David shook his head. "No. They kept serving." Margaret looked surprised. "Who cooked it?" David smiled. "Everyone." He told her how Eric had taken the ladle, how Lily organized the volunteers, and how strangers stayed to wash dishes and clean tables. Margaret listened quietly, tears in her eyes. "That means," she whispered, "they understood." "They did," David said. Margaret took a slow spoonful and laughed softly. "Well," she said, "it needs a little more salt." 2 weeks later, Margaret returned to the restaurant. When she stepped through the door, something incredible happened. The entire room stood up, every customer, every volunteer, even people waiting outside. They began clapping. Margaret froze, completely surprised. "Oh my!" she whispered. Eric approached her with a warm smile. "Welcome back," he said. Margaret looked around. There were now 2 large soup pots, 3 serving tables, and a board on the wall that read, "Kindness Kitchen, inspired by Margaret Collins." Margaret touched the sign gently. "You shouldn't name it after me," she said softly. Eric shook his head. "But you started it." Margaret looked at the crowd, then smiled. "Well," she said, picking up the ladle, "we shouldn't keep people waiting." And just like that, the soup began flowing again. Only this time, it belonged to everyone. One small moment of cruelty had started the story. But it was kindness that finished it. A single bowl of soup turned strangers into a community. A mistake became a movement. And an old woman reminded everyone of something the world often forgets. Kindness is powerful. It spreads quietly. It grows unexpectedly. And sometimes, the smallest act of compassion can feed far more than hunger. It can feed hope. So wherever you are today, be the reason someone believes kindness still exists.